Ouija boards have captivated people's imaginations for decades, often portrayed as harmless toys, a way to communicate with the dead. But for some, using one has opened doors to things better left untouched. These are 10 of the creepiest, most chilling Ouija board stories that went horribly wrong. Stories rooted in reality, where players came face to face with terrifying, unexplainable forces. It started innocently enough. A group of 5 friends, Sarah among them, gathered one night in Sarah's dimly lit living room. They placed a vintage Ouija board on the coffee table, the wood creaking under the weight of their curiosity. The planchette began moving, spelling out words too quickly for anyone to comprehend. Sarah, always the skeptic, laughed it off, but when the board spelled out her name, the mood shifted. The planchette jerked violently to the word help. Sarah's face twisted into an expression of horror as her eyes rolled back, and her voice dropped to an unnatural, deep growl. The other friends froze, terrified, as Sarah's body jerked and contorted unnaturally. It was as though something had taken control of her. "You shouldn't have called me," she rasped, the voice not her own. They ran, but Sarah collapsed, and when they got her to the hospital, doctors couldn't explain what had happened to her. She had no memory of the event, but every time she tried to speak of it, her voice would tremble with a fear she couldn't understand. A couple, Mark and Lily, thought it would be a fun, adventurous way to spend an evening in an old, abandoned house. The house had been empty for years, its walls thick with dust, the floorboards creaking under their feet. The two of them sat down with the Ouija board in the living room, setting it up as the moonlight streamed through broken windows. The moment their fingers touched the planchette, the temperature dropped dramatically, and they could see their breath fogging in the cold air. The planchette began moving on its own, spelling out the name Sarah repeatedly. They didn't think much of it until the lights flickered and the sound of whispers seemed to echo through the house. It wasn't until Lily turned around that she saw a shadow standing in the corner of the room, tall, thin, and eerily still. Mark stood up to check, but as soon as he reached the corner, the door slammed shut behind them. They ran for the exit, but the front door wouldn't open. It was locked from the inside. They managed to escape through a window, but not without hearing faint whispers following them out into the night. The Johnson family, eager to reconnect with their deceased relatives, decided to try using a Ouija board one evening. They had heard the rumors about the board, but they didn't believe in spirits. As they sat in their living room, they began asking the board questions. The planchette began moving on its own, spelling out answers that felt personal, too personal. Suddenly, their youngest child Danny began speaking in a voice that wasn't his own. His small frame began shaking violently, and his voice grew deeper and deeper. He muttered phrases in languages the family didn't recognize, his eyes rolling back as he collapsed onto the floor. The family rushed to help him, but the atmosphere had shifted. Darkness seemed to descend over the room and objects began moving on their own. It wasn't until the next day that Danny remembered nothing. But from that moment on, strange things began happening around the house. Flickering lights, shadows in the corners of rooms, and a cold, oppressive presence that never seemed to leave. 4 teenagers, looking for a thrill, decided to use an Ouija board in the basement of one of their homes. At first, everything seemed normal, until the planchette began moving on its own. The board spelled out, "Leave now or face the consequences." They laughed it off, thinking it was just a joke, but when they tried to end the session, the planchette flew across the board, landing on the floor with a loud crash. They rushed to leave, but when they reached the basement door, it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as they realized the door was locked from the inside. As they scrambled to find another way out, one of the girls, Sarah, screamed. Something had grabbed her ankle, pulling her toward the darkness. She barely managed to escape, but the fear lingered, and for weeks after she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. A woman, desperate to contact her recently deceased mother, decided to use the Ouija board alone in her apartment. The atmosphere was heavy with grief, and she hoped the board might bring some comfort. She sat in the living room, the only light coming from a flickering candle on the coffee table. When she asked the board if her mother was there, the planchette moved slowly, spelling out, "I'm here." But then, everything went eerily quiet. No sound at all. She couldn't hear her own breathing. The air felt thick, suffocating. She felt a presence in the room, an oppressive weight pressing in from all sides. The silence was broken only by a whisper, soft and distant. "Leave now," it said, barely audible, as if it was right next to her ear. She turned around, but no one was there. The board was still, and the room felt like it was closing in on her. She fled the apartment that night, unable to shake the feeling that something was following her. A group of college students looking to entertain themselves one night used a Ouija board in their dorm room. They began by asking innocent questions, but the responses grew more sinister. The board spelled out "dark entity," followed by a chilling message, "It's already here." At first they thought it was just a joke, but then strange things started happening. The lights flickered, the temperature dropped, and one of the students, Tom, saw a dark figure standing in the corner of the room. The figure was tall, featureless, and impossibly still. He tried to get the others' attention, but when they turned to look, the figure vanished. Terrified, they tried to end the session, but the planchette shot off the board, crashing against the wall. The students fled, but that night they all had nightmares about the dark figure watching them. The presence lingered long after the board had been put away. During a late-night seance in their apartment, a group of friends, 3 girls and 2 guys, decided to use an Ouija board. They had done seances before, but this time felt different. The room was dim, lit only by candles, with a heavy oppressive air hanging over them. As soon as they began asking questions, the planchette moved on its own, spelling out a name, Diana. They thought it was just coincidence, but as the planchette continued to move, it began spelling out more unsettling messages. "Get out." The candles flickered violently, casting long, wild shadows across the room. Suddenly the air grew icy cold, and one of the girls, Megan, screamed as something unseen yanked her hair, pulling her backward. The others rushed to help, but they could feel a heavy, invisible force pressing against them. As they tried to break free, the planchette flew off the board and struck the wall with a loud bang. Megan collapsed on the floor, her face pale, her breathing shallow. She swore something had grabbed her ankle, dragging her toward the corner of the room. They ran from the apartment that night, but Megan never fully recovered. She claimed to feel the presence of Diana watching her from the shadows, even in the light of day. After using an Ouija board in their home, a couple began noticing strange, disturbing reflections in every mirror. At first, it was subtle, a face in the background, just out of focus, but the reflections grew clearer and more unsettling. One evening, while getting ready for bed, Sarah looked into the bathroom mirror and froze. Behind her, in the reflection, stood a figure, tall, thin, and shrouded in darkness. She turned around, but no one was there. Over the next few weeks it happened more and more. Faces appeared in mirrors, strange figures watching them from the other side. The couple began to feel like they were being followed, and the mirrors seemed to act as portals to a place they couldn't escape from. One night Sarah was alone in the house when she saw a figure in the bathroom mirror. It was standing directly behind her, its face twisted into a grotesque grin. She screamed and ran out, but when she looked back, the figure was gone. From that night on, the couple moved out of the house. But they never escaped the feeling that the figure was still watching them through the reflections of every mirror they encountered. John had always been curious about the Ouija board, but after a few harmless sessions with friends, he started to feel like something wasn't right. One night, alone in his apartment, he decided to try it again, hoping to contact the spirit of a family member. The planchette moved, spelling out a single, chilling message. "You shouldn't have played with me." The word sent a chill down his spine, but he dismissed it as a prank. However, when he went to bed that night, everything changed. The next morning he woke up to find his apartment ransacked. Drawers pulled out, furniture overturned, but nothing was missing. John's heart pounded as he walked to the door. It was locked from the inside. His windows, all closed and sealed, showed no signs of being tampered with. The strangest part was the feeling of being watched. He couldn't shake the sensation that something, or someone, was standing behind him. He checked the apartment multiple times, but no one was there. The eerie presence remained, and for weeks after, John could never get rid of the feeling that something was following him, waiting just out of sight. He never touched a Ouija board again. A young couple, Amanda and Ethan, had recently moved into an old townhouse. Everything seemed perfect at first, until they decided to try a Ouija board in their new home. It was an old, weathered board tucked away in a box in the attic. They were both curious and skeptical, so they set up the board in the living room one evening. Almost immediately, the planchette began moving, spelling out, "Help." They asked who needed help, but the planchette stopped and moved to the word neighbor. The room grew cold, and a sense of dread filled the air. Amanda felt like someone was watching them. The next day, Ethan went next door to meet their neighbor, but when he knocked, the door opened to reveal an elderly woman, pale and shaking. She looked at him and whispered, "You shouldn't have played with that board. I warned you." Confused, Ethan asked what she meant, but the woman refused to speak further. That night, Amanda awoke to strange noises, scratching sounds like fingernails dragging across the walls. When she looked out the window, she saw the elderly neighbor standing in her yard, staring directly at her with wide, empty eyes. They moved out a week later, but the feeling of being watched never left them. These real-life stories show just how dangerous it can be to tamper with forces you don't understand. The Ouija board might seem like just a game, but for some, it has led to unimaginable horrors.